1284. Matthew was exhausted, but he gripped his prize close, holding the precious cargo as near to his heart as he could. It was but a single straw basket filled with extremely high-quality iron ore. As he almost sprinted through the quickly darkening evening, he gave thanks to both God and to his foreman. His family had worked in this mine for 5 generations, and the foreman had allowed him this one boon in exchange for a cut to his wages until the cost was repaid. Iron for his son, Joshua. His son had been apprenticed to the local blacksmith for years, and the time for his final certification was rapidly approaching. Old man Jacob had been an army bladesmith before he retired due to injury, choosing their small village for the quality iron ore it produced. He was hard to please, and more than once Joshua had come home with bruises and injuries from being overworked. Joshua wanted more than our village life, though, maybe too much truth be told, and had put up with the beatings and injuries so he could find work in the nearby town and live a better life as a craftsman. Matthew supported his son in this, and worked hard to ensure that Joshua could read, never had to worry about being fed and clothed, and always had a kind ear to return home to. It was hard work, and he had to give up many comforts. But after the death of his daughter to wasting sickness, he had promised Joshua a better life for his own children, and was determined to do that no matter what. The weeks passed and Joshua grew nervous. His 7 years was up over a month ago, and still his master had not allowed him to take his final exam. He just sat there watching the younger man as he worked, barely speaking. Joshua wasn't even sure he was awake half the time. Finally, a full 6 months after his term should have been up, Jacob took him aside. He was told the certification would be tomorrow, and he would be making a sword. Joshua spent the night barely able to sleep. He'd not made a proper sword before, and had only observed as his master make them. The next day Joshua brought forth the iron his father had mined with his own hands, and slowly over the course of many hours purified it first into a steel bar, then molding and stretching the bar into a sword. He wasn't the smartest or the strongest, but Joshua was sharp of eye and keen of memory. He had remembered well how his master had forged the blades, and copied the old man's technique stroke for carefully measured stroke. Finally, after almost a full day of work, it was complete. It was a simple but sturdy blade. Quite a long time had been spent treating it with heat to ensure it would be durable and strong. Its hilt and pommel had no decoration save for a simple wrapping of dark boar leather, and the blade was sharpened to a keen edge. Joshua presented it to his master, who had sat and watched the whole time. Jacob had barely moved in his seat save the movement of his head and eyes as he stared at his apprentice, watching him, evaluating his every movement and decision. The old man took the blade and checked it over. Testing the edge with a thumb, he found it sharp. The balance was a bit off, but easily compensated for by even amateur wielders, and the sword held together well. The grizzled old bladesmith grunted in approval, and Joshua thought he saw a hint of a smile in that heat-scarred face. Good quality work. You're an apprentice no longer. I grant you the rank of journeyman. May you grow to create works that surpass my own. 1642. The sword lay on the linen sheets of his modest home in Roma. Though expensive, he felt he owed it to his great-grandfather to have it fixed up and resharpened, and the smith had done good work. Family lore had said his ancestor made this sword, and it was treasured by the family as an heirloom even though it was no longer used to defend the life of the wielder. But what lives it had seen, what lives it had taken. Bartolomeo sat in a wooden chair nearby, admiring it. His family had so many stories about this simple and unadorned blade. It had seen much use in many conflicts, from open wars to peasant revolts. So many of the great historical battles from the last few centuries had this blade as a witness. He sat there, looking over his latest manuscript. A poem about his great-grandfather's deeds in the Dutch War for Independence. Thought it still raged on far to the north. The old man had just died this past Thursday, and his stories had fueled Bartolomeo's imagination since boyhood. None of his works had ever seen great success, but this one was sure to wow them. He sighed, he indulging in his all-too-common daydream of fame and grandeur again. He half thought these childish fantasies were the reason he hadn't been noticed. Too much time with his head in the clouds. But he was a poet after all. His head was meant to be in the clouds. He shook his head and picked up his quill once more, determined to at least finish this poem before week's end. But suddenly an idea struck him. an idea for a new poem. A better poem. According to his family records and history, the sword he now had was never once used in anger or malice. Neither hate nor jealousy had wielded it to harm, and while it had taken at least a few score of lives in the battles it had seen, it was never raised against those who would seek to aid others. The family lore held that it had been used against traitors and tyrants, along with those who supported them. The records were old and dusty, kept in storage by an uncle in Firenze, but all quite intact. Bartolomeo pondered if he had enough left to make the trip, because the idea had stuck in his mind. The story of a sword that was wielded by those who sought peace. It would wipe the smirks off the faces of those fools who looked down upon him for sure. It was a topic worthy of a great epic, a story that would ensure his name was revered for generations to come. He set about feverishly writing down idea after idea, occasionally glancing over at the plain blade. It was not grand enough, he thought. He would have to have it engraved. The 1985. Sarah had no idea why Marcus was so enamored with that old relic. He was 8 years old and he obsessed over it, reading books passed down through generations of her husband's family about the people who had kept it, even if they never used it. The damn things were piled around his room, and the sword hung on the wall above his bed. She had seen him staring at it in the night more than once. He probably dreamed of being there for the battles it was used in. They had never been wealthy, those wielders, but they always seemed to be at the center of uprisings. Wrong place, wrong time, she thought. Or maybe those wielders had been far bigger troublemakers than her husband had let on. The sword had taken, at least by the count the books had talked about, 132 lives over the course of history. Tyrants, traitors, soldiers, highwaymen. The books detailed them all, journals kept by her husband's ancestors and passed down as part of the family record. Marcus could probably name all the slain from memory. He had spent so much time reading them. His father could as well. Like father, like son, she supposed. They had both been in love with that sword and its history. Her husband taught Marcus to read using those damn journals. She sighed as she looked down at her son sleeping next to her, shoving all thoughts of the sword out of her mind. Her husband had died 2 months ago, and the family the sword came from was certainly not going to help them anymore. It was not her fault, she screamed in her mind. Why did they blame her? She sat in her son's rooms, just on the edge of the bed, idly stroking his blonde hair. It looked so much like his father's, as did he. She saw it in his eyes, his walk, the way his head tilted to the left when he was thinking. Most of all, it was in his smile. They had the exact same way of smiling, and for the last 2 months she had to look away whenever her own son smiled because it wrenched at her heart. She looked up at the sword, sitting in its simple leather sheath above the bed. Maybe she could sell it to a museum. Get enough to last them a while if she threw in the books. It's not like it was useful to anyone anymore. Thing was rusted and useless, its edge long since dulled. Maybe a collector? Her friend had gotten almost $1,000 from one for an old coin she found. What would they pay for a sword? Her thoughts were interrupted by a noise. At first she thought it had come from next door, but another noise came on the heels of the first, and she realized it was coming from the kitchen. She snapped her head around to look at the base of the bed, and the green eyes of their moggy cat stared back at her. Her blood ran cold as she realized what was going on, and she shook her son awake with a hand over his mouth. Hide in the closet was all she got out before she heard a noise at the end of the hallway. Marcus scrambled for the door to the darkened closet and the cat fled to hide. She snatched up the nearby lava lamp she had bought Marcus a year ago. It was heavy, might do some damage if thrown. The intruder stepped into the door then. He was huge. Head and shoulders above her frame, he wasn't muscular but exuded a strength. He started to speak, but before she could hear his words, Sarah hurled the lamp at him, scrambling onto the bed to grab the sword. The lamp missed, and the man laughed as he advanced into the room, not perturbed in the slightest by some woman with a rusted sword. Not mine! She lunged at him, desperate to make sure he wouldn't hurt Marcus, and missed, slamming into the ground and knocking the wind out of her lungs. Her body was in pain. The stone floors she had collided into hurt like hell, but she turned over quickly, scrambling back in terror and swiping in front of her wildly with one hand.